So welcome today for one more of our practice example interviews for the Support Center for Data Sharing. For the ones of you who are new to our work, the European Union asked us to research the legal and technical aspects that make data sharing possible today in Europe and beyond, learning from the practices of companies, governments, practitioners in general, and trying to learn what can be reused and treasured out of that experience. One key assumption we make in our work is that we are all learning in this space, and every experience is valuable, even just for the more peculiar choices or drivers that made one license, like in the case of IBM, we will be talking today or a model by which data sharing is implemented interesting. So we have with me someone who is new, at least from a video perspective, to the project. That is Hans Graux. Would you like to introduce yourself, Hans?
Certainly. So indeed, I'm Hans. I'm part of the team working on the support center. I am a lawyer, ICT lawyer, based in Brussels, and yeah, we do a lot of work. We've been doing a lot of work last few years around data sharing, data licensing, data exploitations, and particularly how to facilitate the further reuse of data within the European market.
Thank you, Hans. And my name, for the ones of you who don't know me, is Gianfranco Cecconi. I lead the consortium that runs the project for the European Commission. And our guest today is Chris O'Neill. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Chris O'Neill. I am an Associate General Counsel of Intellectual Property Law at IBM. And I specialize in data law uses, data law issues for IBM. I've been involved in this for several years, since late 2016, and have seen quite a bit of evolution during that time in data issues and both in the sort of commercial side of it as well as in the open data side of things.
So one of the reasons I was looking forward to this chat with you, Chris, is that it's very easy to find guests on the technical side. And in a way, perhaps I exaggerate when I say that the technology is the least of the problems here. So technology, we can fix it, right? Just throw money at it, it's fine. But the legal aspect of it, it's a headache, at least to me. My background is not legal. Hans will testify that I'm quite interested in the legal aspects of it, and with the background in open data, I'm very comfortable with licenses. But from your perspective, and perhaps is a way to break the ice and start talking about this. So why is the legal aspects of data sharing such of a problem? Why do we need to talk so much about it?
Well, I think that I'm not sure that the legal aspects really are as much of a problem as is the fact that we're very early in sort of the experience curve, I think, for data holders to recognize the value of sharing data, the issues associated with sharing data. I think one of the things, at least from my observation, is that when we first started doing in sort of the data analysis business, previously we sold software that customers would run in their own, behind their own firewall, and would help them break down their own data repositories and extract value from those. When we introduced our Watson product line a few years ago, we sort of embarked on a new course where because Watson is an enormously complicated system to actually stand up and run, we determined that it made sense to run that as essentially a hosted offering. And that really required a business model where we would collaborate with the customer to train Watson on whatever data set they wanted to analyze. And then we would essentially feed that data into Watson to develop what we term insights. Essentially, whatever observations or wisdom they're looking to extract from that data, and then deliver those back to the customer. And one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest challenges that we had were some of the legal negotiations associated with, what are the legal rights, not only in the data that we're analyzing, but also in the data that comes out of that process. And also recognizing that in some measure, one of the aspects of AI, which is probably very well understood by the technical community, but it's not necessarily so well understood by the legal community, is the fact that it's not as if there's a clear line of demarcation between the data and the software that analyzes the data. In fact, the software that analyzes the data, part of the reason it's called artificial intelligence is that the software learns from the data that it analyzes. And so in some respects, there is a growth in the accuracy, the quality of the software, the more data it's trained on. And that includes data that may be very proprietary to a customer. But in the end, our product is built gradually by its exposure to all these different data sets. So part of one of the big issues that we found ourselves negotiating over and over again is what rights we have to, we obviously want to be able to continue offering Watson services to other customers, but if you think about it, after Watson does an engagement, Watson, just like the people that would, if you had people like yourselves going into a customer and consulting with them, you walk out of that engagement and you're a different person. You've learned something from your experience in solving that customer's problems or what have you. The machine basically is doing something similar, or at least analogous. And so one of the big challenges for us was to be able to continue to grow Watson in its capabilities through the experience of doing multiple customer engagements, being associated and exposed to lots of different forms of data, and having its semantic library expanded by exposure to all those data sets. So that is a huge part of our, from a commercial business, as we were developing offerings in this space, that's been an enormous issue for us, and it occupied an enormous amount of time, in terms of our business model and our ability to negotiate contracts.
I like that there is a very tangible origin story to your work. So you actually had a problem to solve. So with Watson being so important in your product line, your service line, perhaps in better word in this case, you needed to have a very clear picture of where your rights ended, where your client's rights started, and to what degree you could reuse what your AIs had learned as they went through the process.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. The other thing that's also true is that different industries have different attitudes about the economic value of data. And so one of the industries that we chose to expand into is sort of the healthcare industry. And we built a substantial business in specialized, and actually a data business, in addition to just an analysis business, a data business where we acquired a bunch of companies that did, it had significant data repositories of their own. And one of the things that we learned is in the healthcare space in particular, and the pharmaceutical space, data is the asset. And so recognizing, but in other spaces, it's not so much. It's a collateral thing. You might look, so for example, I'll just take a totally and completely hypothetical example. Take a look at a product manufacturer who has reliability data associated with its products in the field. And it wants to be able to mine that data to figure out, okay, I want to find out which component parts are the least reliable and I want to be able to analyze all of my support records for every product that I've made and figure out trends. Is it this particular type of connector? Is it a particular vendor? Where's the critical points of failure or what have you in my systems? The actual maintenance data itself is not necessarily perceived by the customer as being the critical. I mean, I obviously don't want it out on the internet, but that data is not perceived to them to be a center of value. The insights that you are generating, the analysis of that data set has real value. On the health side, very often what we found was that the data itself had very significant commercial value, and customers had a very different attitude about the resultant rights, and as well as the importance of the data itself and the importance of protecting the data as an item of value itself. So it's a challenge that's really driven by not just the data itself, but also how that industry has attached value to data up until that point in time. And that's something that's going to be variable. It's going to depend on which industry you're dealing with and what the issues are with them and how that business area has evolved in terms of placing value on data sets.
And the specificity of the industry is something we'd like to go back to later. So going into the original problem then, what was IBM's solution to the riddle you described earlier?
Well, so the challenge in the negotiations is less about the IP rights in the data. We don't seek to gain licenses to the data, except to the extent that we need to use them to perform the work. The big issue in negotiations is, what rights do we have to the insights? And is there any sort of, so when I talk about insights, let me just make sure that I'm being clear. So if you think about the data itself, the tables of figures or information or what have you that you're actually running through, in this case, the Watson engine, it pre-exists the engagement. It's just kept in the ordinary course of business by the customer. It's proprietary to the customer. So we have otherwise, we come into the engagement, we don't know about any of that stuff. We have to learn about it in order to do what we call training Watson. And the reason why is because an AI system, a data analysis system like Watson, it may be smart, but it's naive. It doesn't really know anything. So a baby comes out, it's born, it's got every brain cell it's ever going to have, but it doesn't know how to use those brain cells, right? It has to be taught. It has to be taught language. It has to be taught syntax. It has to be taught manners. It has to be taught all of the things that we all learn in our education process. Well, basically, a machine has to be taught analogously to understand the input that it's going to get. And the way you do that is you take a subset of the data that it needs to look at, and you basically just do an extensive process of trial and error. And you have people who know how to interpret that data, helping the machine to understand when it goes and reaches a bunch of conclusions, some of which are right and many of which are totally wrong. It tells the machine, no, this one's wrong and this one's right. And eventually the machine starts to improve its interpretation, because it's learning what the difference is between right and wrong, what the right way to interpret this information is, what the wrong way is, what the key terms are, those sorts of things. So because the system is naive before it's trained, obviously the more engagements you have, the larger its operational vocabulary becomes, and the more efficient the training becomes as time goes on within a particular area. So one of the things that's a challenge is you have customers, say for example, they have their own competitors. So the same vocabulary that works for one customer may work quite well for another customer. The first customer doesn't want you to be able to use the vocabulary that Watson's learned in the training process because that just helps his competitor. He doesn't have to do, his competitor doesn't have to do as much training because the machine's already learned a lot of the vocabulary. So this is a challenge. And, you know, and some of it is a sales challenge where you have to explain to the customer, look, you're getting these insights a lot sooner than your competitor's getting them. But you also need to recognize and see it our way, from our perspective as well. The system will be better and an analyst. And the next time you get it, you'll also get the benefit of everybody else's data having been trained, you know, the system having been trained on everybody else's data. So there, you know, and a lot of that is a sales story. It's helping people understand the value of sharing. And I think that that's something, and so when just to tie it back to the sort of the start of my remarks, a lot of this is a process where people start to, you know, you have to sort of adopt a new thinking that says maybe it's actually better that I'm not keeping everything behind the four walls. Maybe I can benefit from that. There's a synergy in having multiple data sets assessed and some of that wisdom captured and you know, and so the child getting smarter, right? There's a value to me if I'm hiring a consultant, you know, the fact that I'm using a consultant who has done 20 previous healthcare, you know, deals and understands a lot about the industry saves me a lot of time in explaining my business to them, because there's going to be a lot of stuff that they're going to be, oh yeah, I've seen that, you know, a dozen times before. You don't have to explain that to me. I know exactly why you want to do that. And you're probably worried about this, and, you know, and everyone says, oh, this is great. I've got somebody who's actually experienced, right? So that's the thing. And it's really not that different for the machine. And so that's kind of, so when I say it's an attitude adjustment that we're starting to see, I think it really is. And people just are thinking about this now that it's capable. It's possible to teach a machine like you teach a consultant.
Yep.
It's expanding everyone's sense of the possibilities. And, you know, obviously when we look at this COVID thing, you know, it's a worldwide problem. The fact that we can collect data and look at data from all over the world makes us all smarter. And that's, you know, so there are those principles that take a long time. And so, you know, tying back to one of my other interests, which is open data. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about that here, but one of the things that we analogized to was the open source movement 25 years ago, when at the beginning, commercial companies in particular were afraid of open source. They were like, this will take away all our competitive advantage, because their whole business had been built on building some complex, convoluted thing that they kept hidden and behind trade secret walls or what have you, and then competing with other people who had done exactly the same thing. And people talked about sort of the dream of, wouldn't it be nice if there were certain basic functions that everything had to have, and we just did it once and everybody used it. And so then we could focus on what makes our stuff different. And so some smart people finally got together and started to think about, hey, could this work? And in fact, one of the growth in computing standards has been, and software standards has really been tied together with the open source movement. And a recognition that if you wanted to establish an industry standard, the first thing that you did was come up with a standard. The second thing that you did was come up with an open source project that implemented the standard. And so software providers could just go to the open source project, pull down the code, put it into their product, and then all of a sudden they're standards compliant for whatever that standard is. They don't have to spend an enormous amount of money testing. They don't have to spend an enormous amount of money having a dedicated development team do this. Instead, they're able to concentrate their resources on that part of their software that makes their software different, that delivers value to the marketplace. And so everybody, in the end, everyone benefits, because everyone's standards compliant and everyone's essentially sharing the expense of achieving that. And so so what we had seen was that, at least in our business, that the open source movement made a tremendous difference in our own software business. And what we wanted to do was we set out to try to capture some of the things that we had learned in that process and apply it to data, because we saw that ultimately the promise of data was best achieved by data sharing. That yes, there are obviously going to be proprietary databases and data collections. That's very important, but that overall that there was a role for sharing in the development of a data-centric world. And so that was a huge part of what we were after when we created, the open data agreements that we created, and as we've gone forward, we're starting to see this take hold now. A lot of the work was actually done a couple of years ago, but people are coming to it now and starting to recognize the value. And although it sort of sounds ghoulish, I mean, this COVID thing is a great example, and I think people are starting to see, some of that value. It's starting to pop into popular consciousness now. We start to see the real value, because we can speed up vaccine development. We can speed up, spread information. We have a much better idea of what we're dealing with, even though nobody knew anything about this thing only 4 months ago. And it's a threat to the entire world. It's a huge threat to the world economy, but we are fighting it together in a way that we never could have done even 2 or 3 years ago. So
there's a point you made that I like a lot. That when the analogy with consulting, also the point about the second client of IBM will benefit from the learning of Watson on the first. And if you just name two, it feels a bit odd. Like, so why would I be the first client when the other is going to benefit? But if you project that over time, it's like the circle closes. It's like the first one may benefit back from the other 12 clients. It's like a common is created by the knowledge that either those people in consulting or those AIs being shared among different users can create. And the fact that there is awareness and we can develop awareness of the value of that is per se an amazing opportunity to exploit. Going though more in the detail of the tools we have to make, at least to give some comfort, perhaps to the one of us who are more conservative, don't feel like sharing that much or enjoying this common culture. Where do licensing come in? When is it that perhaps we need a contract and perhaps a one-to-one thing between IBM and your client, for example? Where is it that we can make an economies of scale, perhaps, and use a license or share a license or reuse a license? And to what degree license need to be special or specialized? So I believe, Hans, I'm sure it's going to say something about computational use in licenses. So
yep.
For the ones of us who perhaps can't even tell the difference between a contract and a license, can you start perhaps from a bit of the basics without going too much in detail? But in what way is a license different from a contract, and how does a license work for the case you described?
Well, I mean, first off, in virtually every commercial engagement, you're going to have a contract, and the contract will have, especially in a contract, in the IT space or in the consulting space, the contract will almost certainly have intellectual property provisions. In essence, a lot of people place a huge value on the distinction between a license and a contract. I don't particularly. I mean, effectively, licenses are contracts. Very often, a license represents essentially it's a set of rights that are given over where the law defines certain ownership rights or rights to control particular categories of intellectual property, and so in areas where there is a uniform doctrine of law that protects a piece of intellectual property, say for example, a piece of software. Software is pretty much universally copyrightable. So whether it's the the header files, or whether it's the kernel, or whatever part of software it is, it's all copyrightable. And in essence, you could write a permission which would serve as a license that says you have the right to use my software, to you have a right to execute my software, to copy my software. I can give you those rights. And so you could think of that piece of paper as a license, because it's essentially dealing with a copyright that exists in law, that I own, and I'm essentially giving you permission. Technically speaking, though, that is accomplished. It's a contract, right? It's still a contract. It's just, it deals exclusively with those particular intellectual property rights. One of the challenges that we have in data is that data is not typically uniformly protectable by any one body of law. So, and I apologize if I get into the weeds a little bit, but whereas copyright uniformly applies to software, it applies to the header files, it applies to the footer files, it applies to the kernel, all the different components of the piece of software are all covered by copyright. Depending on what the data is, copyright may not apply to every single piece of data in a database. It may apply to elements of the database itself. It may apply to entries in the database that are themselves copyrightable, but it doesn't necessarily apply to, for example, if you have a table of temperature readings. Temperature readings are, there's no creativity in temperature readings. They're typically expressed, in some sort of a numerical format. So there's no, I mean, typically for copyright to attach, it has to attach to expression, creative expression. If there's data in there that is purely numerical or observational, a court is likely to say that's not copyrightable. It can't be protected by copyright. So how do you protect it? It may have cost you a fortune to collect that data. So there's obviously an investment in it. And so you have to find some other ground for legal protection in order to prevent people from just taking it. And so in essence, what we, it sounds conceptually difficult, but actually it's easy because you always have a contract. So you just build the clauses in, and as a function of contract, the elements of the database are all protected because you include a statement that these are protected. We are going to, for contractual purposes, we're going to treat this as your asset, not mine, and we're not going to copy it, or we're not going to do whatever you don't want us to do. And so effectively, the distinction between license and contract is a little bit, it strikes me as being overblown. It's not really necessary to make that distinction. And we don't actually try. For example, in the open data agreement that we worked on with the Linux Foundation, we're unabashed about it. It's absolutely a contract. We have contract recitations at the beginning. It's not a signed contract, but it's accepted by performance, which is a established means of doing business in the IT space. And it's, but we have all the recitations, and we depend on that because, if you don't have the opportunity, and you don't in an open data context, of sitting down across the table from the other guy and saying, okay, we're gonna make a deal, and we're gonna write it all down and sign it, and seal it in blood or whatever. How do you actually come up with a set of rights that where you have some level of predictability, of what permissions you've given and what you haven't given. So.
I believe Hans said something for
Yeah,
you.
it's, I mean, I have a ton of follow-up sort of questions or observations, but thank you, first of all, for the whole clarification. I thought it highlights some interesting characteristics in both of the licenses, like, for instance, the fact indeed that it doesn't assume that somebody claims ownership of the data or says this, I have the copyright, or your use of this data might otherwise be an infringement of my rights were it not for this particular agreement that we're using. The emphasis of the agreements, as I see them, is indeed very much on saying, you can use this. I'm not going to go into the sort of the philosophical debates on what rights I may have to this data, which can be very different from situation to situation. The point of this agreement is not to say, I own it however you can. It's just to say the second part, you are allowed to use this data. So I thought that was one part which was very interesting because I think it brings across very much the philosophy that you mentioned. And the second point, I just wanted to get your feedback or your feeling on that. What also was interesting is that the agreement says, you can, both of the templates say you can use this data for whatever purposes you envisage, including but not limited to computational use. So to me, that was interesting because one of the first things that you do nowadays is when you analyze these kinds of data licenses is to look at, how does this support scientific research? Is there any kind of specific provision for that, for allowing academics to use it more freely? Is there any reference to that? Scientific research, deep learning, big data, AI. And actually, the licenses that you provide, both of them, are very flexible on that point, because indeed they say you can use this data, including for computational analysis, but they don't actually constrain themselves. They don't say you have to then use the data for scientific purposes. And that's interesting because Gianfranco and I, we both experienced that. Then you get a lot of discussions when you have those kinds of constraints about what is scientific research. Like if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're doing scientific research, but obviously in the end you want to have medication or a medical product that you want to sell, is that scientific enough, or does the science behind it somehow gets tainted by the fact that there is a commercial consideration behind it? I mean, it seems funny, but it's interesting to see that the choice you've made just overrides that and says, we actually aren't interested in the fact whether this data might be claimed as your property or as your copyright or your database rights, which are referenced. It doesn't make any statement on that. What we're interested in is the outcome, the fact that you can use it, and we just say you're allowed to use it irrespective of what the precondition is. And we want to enable computational analysis with a description that clearly includes deep learning, but isn't restricted to that. So it seems to give a lot of flexibility for reuse. I thought that was very interesting when looking at both of the templates, actually.
Well, it's thank you for that. And actually, you're absolutely right. One of the things that that was driven really by two different things. One is, maybe at least from an IBM perspective, we're certainly a commercial enterprise, and we also have a very sizable research arm. And so, there's always the question of saying, well, are we fish or fowl? We are legitimately doing research, but some of our research winds up in our products. And obviously, if we weren't making any money, we'd be cutting our research budget. So there, in some measure, it's quite common to see no commercial use types of restrictions, things like that. And those become very problematic because for that's two reasons.
Was it needed the same sort of thing? Neither one of the licenses makes a distinction between commercial and non-commercial use. It's very open on that point as well. Yeah.
Well, the other thing about that is that that's also a reflection of the something called the open source definition. And the open source definition is a definition of what makes an open source license. So it's really influenced by what we call the OSD. And there's actually, it's a website. I don't have it handy, but I can send it to you if you're interested. And it's talking about it in the context of open source licensing. But open source licensing, if you read the GPL or you read the Apache software license or any of the leading open source licenses, none of them impose restrictions on really any use of the software. You have the right to use it. And they may impose obligations on you as far as relicensing derivative works of that software, or making copies, but they don't impose restrictions that say you can do it for this reason but not for that reason. And so we were absolutely trying to harken back to well-known and familiar elements of open source licensing when we came up with this data license. Now the whole computational use side of this is actually, I'm glad you raised it, because I think it's one of the things that makes the data license, the community data license agreement, which is the family of agreements that you're referencing, relatively unique, and certainly was unique when we created it. And that is, what we really tried to do was, what we thought about was, the world is familiar with open source software licenses. It's taken us 25 years, but now, we recognize these, we're not afraid of them. Everybody uses them. We've discovered the value of doing it. We can, we don't make everything open source, but we certainly make a lot of things open source, and people are comfortable with it as long as they understand what the license is. They're okay with it. In the world of data, one of the challenges was, well, is data the same as software, or is data different from software? And the truth is that I would argue that data is quite a bit different from software, but largely, if you think about it, if you go to it, why make it open? So you make software open for a reason, right? It's a tool. It's, it does something, and you may want to tweak it and get it to do something else, or you may want to get it to do something better. And so it as a piece of work, it can be improved. And so people, if they can get access to it, they might be able to, figure out a way to use it in a different way than it's been used, or they can take a bunch of stuff that's in there and add some function to it, or what have you, and use it as a tool. Data, on the other hand, is not like a tool. Data is actually what you use a tool on. And so the whole purpose for disclosing data, sharing data, is to be able to analyze it. So the thing that, when we introduced the concept of the computational use, what we were intending to do was to recognize that the reason that people care about AI, the reason that people care about data analysis in general, is that you can make sense out of something that is otherwise just too large, too vast to be able to do this by hand. And so what we wanted to focus on was a clear right to actually analyze and create analytical works that commented on data, that found value in data without necessarily changing the data. And who would, how would those be governed? Are those technically derivative works in the copyright sense of that data? Well, maybe they are, maybe they're not, depends on what's in them. And so what we wanted to do was introduce that concept. That concept is not captured in copyright law, really almost anywhere. Now we've been introducing. There's been a lot of introduction of text and data mining exceptions to copyright law. Mm-hmm. For example, in the copyright directive in the EU, which passed this past spring, but its adoption status is a little bit up in the air right now. In Japan, there's a TDM provision. There is no TDM provision in U.S. law. Canada is working on one, but what we have is somewhat of an unsettled picture legally of what the rights are. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to take advantage of the fact that when you create a contract, you create a little mini legal environment as well as a, it's essentially, if you enter this world, I can give whatever rights I want to be able to give within the scope of the contract without having to worry about any one particular country's law as dictating one result versus another. So what it does is it adds an element of predictability to the permissible use. And so that was kind of what our goal was to make it clear that the reason that this data is being shared is so it can be analyzed. And we're not seeking to control the output so much as we are to control your rights to pass the data along. So if you were to, I mean, a lot of the issue about you didn't want to write that, we had to be careful about the way we wrote it, because we didn't want to write it in such a way so that you could essentially create an analytical work that contained all the data and wash the data out. So you didn't have any, you know, if it was a copyleft data grant, you could wash yourself right out of the copyright of the copyleft provisions. But we tried to capture that by making it clear that if the analytical works contained anything more than a de minimis amount of the data itself, that they were otherwise exempt from any copyleft obligations. So this was a very conscious decision, and the reason it was, the thing that drove it was really the purpose for which anybody would be sharing data in the first place.
You know, because we talked about this before starting recording, that most of us in this call actually come from the open data world. So we are very comfortable with the concept you shared. So I will be the party breaker here, and I will start complicating the picture by talking about like personal data. So what happens, how does the complication and this kind of great world in which we can share whatever we like, protect the right for a use with a license and so on, is that affected when we start dealing with data where we cannot create those exceptions, those protected environments? What if the data includes personal data? What if it includes confidential elements that we want to keep that way? And in what way the licensing, we named earlier that IBM has worked on 2 licenses, but we didn't really present them. So perhaps can you introduce us to the work that IBM has done creating those 2 licenses that Hans was referring earlier? And in what way do they also allow us to move into the less open world of data that needs to be protected to some degree?
Well, let me start off by saying that I mean, you've obviously, you know, raised the elephants in the room, right? I mean, from an open data licensing perspective, everyone is struggling with this. I mean, we have statutes in the United States. We have a U.S. Open Government Data Act. We've got in Europe, you have the EU Open Data Directive, where governments are struggling. They're dealing with legislative mandates to make their data as open as they can, but you know, significant amounts of personal information is contained in a lot of that data, and certainly in the commercial sphere, you know, if there are confidentiality restrictions, those are also, you know, those also have to be in some way dealt with. In the healthcare space, we have special bodies of law in the U.S. We have the HIPAA statute, for example, which requires that personal health information needs to be encrypted when it's, you know, at rest and in transit. And so there's a lot of really significant protections that apply to a lot of this data. And so I mean, in short answer to your question, we recognize that the open data licensing model is not going to be able to accommodate those restrictions without some level of editing of the data. And the way we sort of tried to deal with it in drafting the agreements was there is a representation. There are certain representations that the person donating data or contributing data under the CDLA agreements has got to make. They have to make a representation that they have the rights essentially to provide data under the agreement. So either, you know, they created the data, or somebody they paid to create the data created the data, or they otherwise have the rights. The second piece is that they have not themselves undertaken any privacy or confidentiality agreements, obligations with respect to the data. And the challenge that you have from and I apologize for going into a little bit more detail, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail just because it's hard to describe. But the challenge about the representation is that when we set out to create this license, we worried about what I'll call the sub-licensing problem. Here you are, you've got, let's just say a hypothetical world, 10 people have contributed data to this great big data set, and you're going to add something, you're going to be the 11th contributor, you're going to contribute your stuff, and then you're going to, put it out on a website, and other people are going to be able to take, that data set from you. And so the real question is, okay, what are you responsible for when you do that? Are you responsible for all the contributions that the 10 people before you had made, as well as your own? Or are you only responsible for your particular contribution? And what we decided to do was to use a licensing method, which is familiar from the open source world, which is which, I don't know, I've heard it described as the hub and spokes method. And the idea is that each data provider extends a license from themselves to the ultimate recipient of the data, wherever they get it from, for their data, but only for their data. So when you take the data license, you go to my website and you take the data from me, you are getting a license from the 10 people who preceded me to their little piece of that, and the 11th from me. And so the idea there is that each of us is warranting, or not warranting, but representing that we had the right to contribute that piece of that data, and that we did not undertake any privacy or confidentiality obligations with respect to our contribution. That doesn't mean that I'm warranting or representing anything about the other 10 people or their data. So so from a licensing perspective, we deliberately chose that format because we wanted to make it legally as uncomplicated for people to contribute data as we could, because we felt that it was very important that data get out there. And so we really were consciously trying to reduce the level of risk for contributors, for potentially assuming liability for other people's contributions, which we didn't want. We just felt that would chill contributions, and we didn't want to do that. So now that doesn't totally answer your question, though. I wanted to get that point out. I mean, so the answer to your question, I think, is that there are going to be categories of data that this licensing vehicle is not appropriate for. And I think that you pretty much hit on both of them. Personal information, private, personal health information, and confidential information are fundamentally incompatible with the concept of open data. So the way to deal with that, the way that we've seen people try to share this information is through anonymization or de-identification. And the challenge that you have with that is that national standards of what constitutes appropriate levels of that activity vary. And we are not going to be able, I think, to be completely certain about how that's going to work in terms of how those different country laws may operate. This is a real thicket. The other issue that is that has emerged as you start recombining data is that there's a concept in European privacy law that if you can that what constitutes PI, something that might otherwise appear to be anonymized, is not legally anonymized if you can, from the entirety of the information disclosed, figure out and tie that information back to an individual. The challenge that you have is that you may not be in complete control of all the information that may ultimately come out of your disclosure. Because if somebody were to take that piece of data that you disclose, that may in and of itself not be disclosing PI, and combine it with some other different set of data, and someone could take that whole of that and say, aha, but I can see over here that this combined with this. And I don't even know how anyone's going to deal with that. I just don't. I just don't. I mean, that's one of those great unknowns. I think,
Yeah.
at least in my mind, that doesn't. I mean, but that is a big challenge.
It's like a bit of an absurd. Like, so if we, perhaps in practice, no, but in theory, every piece of information is re-identifiable if you give yourself enough time and effort to find those bits that allow you to rebuild the puzzle. Still, though, there are spaces where, of course, fine, open data is not the solution, and the entire project we're running exists for that. But there still may be applications, like in medical, where we may want to only have a restricted set of partners perhaps share information. Say, my hospital together with my legal representative, together with my financial advisor. In those cases, do we need special licenses? Do we need to go back to normal contracts? And Hans, perhaps you can add on that. I feel I'm missing the words.
No, that's actually, I think I know, well, I think I know what direction that you were thinking, and I had indeed sort of had a follow-up question on that, because one of the things that Europe is considering right now is encouraging the creation of what they call in European policymaking data spaces, where you indeed focus not specifically on data sets that probably are less suitable to spread to just everybody, because you cannot, for instance, because you cannot anonymize them without completely destroying the value, the scientific value, the reuse value of it. And so part of that idea is to say, well, rather than openly sharing it completely with everybody, which would require anonymization or reworking the data, why don't we focus on making it available to specific designated comparable communities, more homogeneous communities, who will use the data in a common way, which, for instance, leads me back to the whole what is scientific research issue. One example might be that you have, for instance, research hospitals, where you can say, okay, these people have academic credentials, they are bound by duty of confidentiality, of professional secrecy, also legally. So we will allow them to set up one data space where they will share completely non-anonymized personal data for the patients without very much effort at all of removing data, so that they can share it and they can do computational analysis or whatever you want to call it within that sphere. So essentially, I think what I'd be interested in hearing is how you would feel about that trend, because on the one hand, it does encourage data sharing. You wouldn't be able to use the current licenses as written right now because they don't have that kind of control constraint requirement. You would need to build that in, which is a very fundamental change from the more data donorship oriented model that you have right now. On the plus side, it would sort of allow you to create a compromise situation where you say, at least within this data space, more data sharing is happening. It's not open for everybody, but in an environment where basically everybody is doubtful on how much data sharing we want and under which conditions we want, that might be an intermediary solution. So I was just interested in picking your brain on how you feel about that sort of development, whether you think that's good idea, bad idea, or more of a sort of intermediary idea that we might do to basically just to dip our toes in the water and get a feel for how this needs to evolve in the longer term.
Well, I think that first off, I would view the work that we put together, and I admit that I'm not a representative of the Linux Foundation, and they're the data steward, the steward of the agreement, not me. But what I would say is that we didn't create this thing in a vacuum. I mean, we were absolutely trying to capture a lot of the experience and even some of the words of a number of different open source agreements. Yeah, we changed it to deal with unique issues that we saw coming up. And so if the agreement and some of the challenges, the drafting decisions we made, et cetera, can be useful in promoting more limited data sharing in other contexts. I certainly don't see any. I have no pride of authorship in the sense of just feeling like we really did, we tendered this piece of work to the data communities of the future as a model for responsible licensing, and as a suggestion of ways that you can do this. So the system that you described certainly makes sense to me. Obviously, the GDPR is an extraordinarily thoughtful and complicated set of provisions. It's a bear to try to figure out how to comply with, and some of the challenges of particularly health data and striking the right balance between PI and in condition information and those kinds of things are the really legitimate social controversies of the day. We have, think about in the U.S. we have a lot of worries about this whole genetic thing. It's like as the human genome is now known, people worry that they're going to be discriminated against because of stuff in their genome that they can't control. And it hasn't hit the legislative side of things yet, but it's coming. So I think we have to be flexible to try to use the tools that we have to try to solve the problems that our own efforts thus far have where we've gotten to. So I have no issue as far as if somebody wants to grab our computational use definition and put it into another agreement that's maybe of a narrower scope, I'd be delighted. I have no issue. What I would want is that the decision to make available that information or to set up that data zone has been thoughtfully and conceived of and decided by the responsible folks. So I'm totally fine with that.
Looking at the future, also in the interest of time, assuming you're still working in this section, you will still be working for a long time on this. What would you expect is the next challenge you can fix for IBM in this space? Is a new version of those licenses perhaps coming, or there is another problem that you need to fix first?
I think that from the perspective of the licenses, I'll start there. These licenses have been in existence since the end of 2017, and I think we put them out there, and frankly, it was a little bit of one of these things. It's like, hey, it's a great idea, but like nobody's ready to use them yet, and that was because I think of the phenomenon where people just weren't ready to sort of wrap their heads around the notion that data isn't just something that you put in a closet and you only take out, if you can wrap it in so much confidentiality and, and treat it as the crown jewels, et cetera, that the marketplace wasn't quite ready to see, and particularly the commercial marketplace wasn't ready to see data as a public good or having any public good types of elements to it. I think we're starting to see that turn. Obviously I've done a lot of talks, never anything quite like this before, but I've done a lot of talks to try to educate people about this license. And a lot of people are like, wow, I didn't even know this existed. And, and I can understand that. I mean, it's not like this is the sort of thing that people just run around saying, oh, look at this. It's like, what's new on Instagram or something. But the reality is that I expect that we are going to see from a legal perspective and from a drafting perspective, I think the next big challenge we're going to see after sort of getting the word out and seeing people start to really use the agreement in practice more, and we've started using it ourselves, is uh, is focusing on the issue of compatibility between licenses. So for example, I mean, the real value comes not just from people releasing data sets that sit there like individual islands, but being able to combine data with other data islands out there. And right now, the biggest challenge that you see, and it's mostly a function of copyleft licensing, where you have, each island is saying, oh no, you can only distribute my data under the terms of this license versus another license, et cetera, is are license restrictions like that going to prevent the combination, recombination, experimentation, of data sets? And that would be a shame if it did. And so one of the things I anticipate we will be working on over the next year, although we haven't yet begun, is a real effort with some of the other major licensing communities to establish a framework where data sets that are licensed under our various license agreements can be combined, and establishing that level of license compatibility. That's something that's sort of the 200 level licensing thing. We're at the 101 level right now. We're just trying to get people through the survey course, but 200, now you're starting to get into those major courses. We're going to try and, hopefully amp this baby up. So that'd be my sense.
And on a similar line of thought, this is what you and the others are working on licensing can achieve. What do you need from the legal system in the first place? Say copyright reform or anything on that space? Is it something that you and other lawyers like you are autonomous in writing the future of licensing, or you also need the legislative system to change around you? As a newbie, I expect that most of the law will be based on, also I'm thinking to Hans as well, perhaps you have your own opinion on this. Most of the law we build our understanding upon today has probably been written well before the digital age, concept of property and stuff. Do we need the basics of the legislative system to change as well, or that would be too ambitious to chase?
Well, I think if I can color the question, because I'm more interested in getting Chris's opinion, but I think if I can add some color to that question, I think it's also interesting to see, do you need the legislation to change, or can you drive changes in society forward under the current legal framework? So if you look at it, I remember at the very early stages of open source software, there were people saying, software shouldn't be subject to copyright at all, because software it's an algorithm. It's more comparable to a mathematical equation. Mathematical equations can't be subject to copyright. That was a sort of a fringe perspective that obviously in the long term didn't win the legislation, because software is copyright protected. That's not ambiguous anymore. But still, the open source software movement has existed and has gone on and has captured quite a substantial part of the markets. It's less visible maybe because of cloud computing, but it is there. And I think the question then becomes indeed, is there a need or a benefit for legislation to change? Or do you think that data sharing will happen anyway, because you can build it basically? I think that's the question, whether this can be built bottom up, or whether you need the top down part, top down being new legislation on data sharing as well. Bottom up just being, we need to convince people, we need to show them that data sharing is a good thing. And then they will naturally gravitate towards these kinds of community-based licensing models, irrespective of what legislators do, essentially.
I mean, I think that here's my view. My view is that legislative change and evolution is desirable. You're absolutely right to observe that the law always trails technology. I mean, and having worked for 30 years in a technology company, as a lawyer, a lot of what I've done has been guessing at how a court would interpret this new technology, even though the only precedents it has to consider are ones that are based on old technologies. And so there's a certain amount of prognostication that's inevitably involved in advising in that kind of a context. What I would say is that I think that some of the developments that we're starting to see, the EU copyright directive, its recognition that text and data mining protection should be extended beyond just for research and non-commercial purposes, and extended even to commercial purposes is laudable. And what I worry about is, and certainly in Japan, they have a very nicely thought out set of TDM provisions. In the US, we don't have TDM legislation, but we do have the fair use doctrine, which has so far been favorably interpreted to favor the development of a lot of the technological approaches that we've utilized to create what we now call AI, even though it didn't start off that way. I mean, we didn't call it AI from the beginning, but the fact is that in some measure, a lot of that legal infrastructure is very much individual case driven. It's very fact specific. It requires a large budget to even get to a decision, and there's a lot of delay associated in getting certainty. And so from a commercial perspective, companies are going to, necessarily be concerned about investing money if they don't have some assurance that what they're doing is likely to be found legal and defensible. So absolutely, legislative progress is greatly appreciated, and we are very actively involved with urging governmental entities to do that, to adopt logical and reasonable and non-discriminatory TDM exceptions, for example, and those are particularly important in the data context, because that's really what you do with data. But at the same time, we can't wait for that, and so it's really a multi-pronged approach. And so what I described sort of with the data agreement, or the open data agreements, the CDLA, is an effort to say we're going to define our own little universe in the context of the contract that is going to establish the permissions, because private parties can do that, and those can be a reservoir of permission even in a hostile legal world, because the law is at least consistent in honoring the parties to a contract's ability to agree within certain public policy dimensions, to agree that certain results should come from the party's consensual choice to enter into the agreement. So I think the answer is yes, we're gonna continue on both fronts. We absolutely think that copyright law needs to modernize, and not just in Europe or in Asia or in the Commonwealth countries, but in the United States as well. And there's no question that we've suggested to the USPTO, which was asked us to comment on AI issues and copyright and other intellectual property areas. What do we think? And we did suggest, look, you ought to look at this TDM stuff that's going on, these specific TDM provisions. This would be a rational way to improve certainty for citizens in understanding what the law will protect. And in the absence of that, we have to rely on license agreements.
Okay.
So,
thanks a lot for your time. I mean, I have a feeling we could keep talking for a very long time here.
sorry to run on.
No, it's not the fault. I mean, I guess we are all buffs of these kind of topics to some degree because of our background. Can I count on you coming back perhaps 1 year from now to tell us what you've been working on in the meantime? Because the project will still be going by then. I'm sure you will have more stories. Great. Sure. And in the meantime, thank you again to you, to IBM, to Jared that was with us, and keep following us on Support Center for Data Sharing, and look forward to see perhaps more work from IBM being reviewed by us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.